Hello, fellow game masters, dungeon masters, storytellers, referees, and many more. Welcome to The Game Master, a podcast dedicated to helping you become the best game master you can be. I'm your host, Talon Manley. Many game masters, especially newer ones, struggle with world building. They either overbuild it and the players don't get to experience everything, or they underbuild it and must improvise vast swaths of the world during the session. Therefore, today's episode is all about different world building techniques to help you create more immersive and enjoyable worlds for your players to explore. Welcome to episode 2, The World Shaper, creating a believable and immersive world. Before we jump into today's episode, I want to take a moment to plug some other social medias. Be sure to check out the website talonmanley.com, that's TALONMANLEY.com, for merch, memberships, and my other social media platforms. I'm active on Twitter for, as long as Twitter's around, and TikTok and YouTube by my name, Talon Manley. Be sure to check those out too. Now, on to the episode. There are many ways to go about building a setting for your campaign. From building out to building in, top down to bottom up, and I'm going to go over several, as well as how I personally build my world so that you can make the most informed decision on how to build your next setting. The first thing to consider is what type of campaign you're wanting to run. Take some time to brainstorm and think up some ideas. Are you wanting to run something that's more of a dark fantasy campaign where the players are fighting for their very lives? Or are you wanting to run something more akin to a hex crawl, where your party is exploring the world and all of its ancient ruins? Whatever it is you're wanting to run, taking that into consideration will help you get started in finding the detail of what type of setting to build. You really want your setting to complement the type of campaign you're running. It can be pretty jarring and throw off a lot of the story if your setting and campaign don't really match up in style. Continuing on with brainstorming, consider what type of culture your setting has. Does it have something more akin to a real-world culture, maybe a blend of real-world cultures? For example, I have built a couple settings that have based their cultures off of real-world cultures. There was one where I built, it was based off of the Ottoman Empire, and another off the Persian Empire with some medieval Polish sprinkled in. The culture you create will persist throughout the whole campaign as your players explore your setting, so it's very important to nail down early so you can then start building it out and adapting it as needed. There are several influences to think about when you're brainstorming up a culture as well. Things such as time period, geography, history, and religion, all of which are important aspects that create a whole culture, so let's dig into some of them. The first thing I want to talk about is religion. Religion, generally speaking, plays a very large part in TTRPGs, especially D&D based ones because of paladins and clerics. And in D&D, and systems similar to it, the religion is real. The deities the people worship are real and active and awe-inspiringly powerful, thus making it extremely important to consider what type of religion is in place. Is it a monotheistic? Is it polytheistic? Does it have ideals of reincarnation or an afterlife? What do the deities think of the mortal races? Is it a loose pantheon or is it a tight pantheon? For those that aren't sure what I mean by a loose pantheon and tight pantheon, let me explain a little bit. A loose pantheon is where each individual deity is worshipped on their own. They have priests, clerics, and churches dedicated to a single or a couple of deities. Think your classic D&D Forgotten Realms pantheon, or the Elder Scrolls pantheon. Those are loose pantheons. Whereas a tight pantheon, the individuality of each deity doesn't matter as they are worshipped as a whole as a single deity. Generally given titles such as the Ten, for example. You won't find churches to a single deity in a tight pantheon, or a cleric or priest who worships a single deity. Instead, you'll find churches for the whole pantheon, and priests who worship and preach about all the deities as one. Once you've figured out which type of pantheon you want, it's important to think up what each deity wants out of the mortal realm. what they think of each other, and you can even go as deep as figuring out a personality, symbols, and tenets for each as well. Which, if I'm being honest, if you're playing D&D or a similar system, you might want to create some symbols and tenets for the deities, as those will be important if you have clerics and paladins in the party. From there, I would start thinking about some ideals for the religion. What sort of actions in life does the religion value highly, and what does it demonize? How should a worshiper of this faith hold themselves in their daily life, and what sort of sins should they avoid? Once you got the details of the religion at least loosely in place, you're ready to start thinking of the next thing and brainstorming that. I suggest identifying what time period and what sort of technology you want your setting to be in and to have. For fantasy TTRPGs, are you thinking of an early medieval period where gunpowder wasn't around or even really known about? Note, I am not a historian, don't come at me. Or maybe you want something more akin to a later medieval period, where gunpowder was more widely adopted as the standard for sieges and specialized troops. For more modern TTRPGs or even sci-fi TTRPGs, you really need to think about what sort of technology is available and accessible to the majority of the populace to find out what time period you're going to have your setting in. The next big thing to think up and brainstorm is what type of government is in this world. There are hundreds of different government styles for you to build and spend time thinking on. But I want to preface this portion by stating that even a bare bones and rough governmental structure is better than nothing, especially if your players aren't the type that enjoy the political side of the game. The reason it's important to think up the style of government for your setting is because it helps the world feel alive and lived in. There's laws that are implemented and followed, there's factions within the government that could be vying for power, there's drama and story hooks, and then of course, there's the immersion. With that out of the way, let's talk government styles. Governments can range from being completely owned by a single corporation to a full feudal system to a federation. You could also have a balkanized government, which is a system in which there's no central ruling power and there are actually rival governments fighting for control of land and resources. In my experience, the most popular style of government for fantasy campaigns is the feudal government, which is ruled by a king at the top, and then beneath them are different rulers with their own land, soldiers, castles, cities, towns, and villages. Each of those rulers will then donate coin, resources, and soldiers to the ruler above them in time of need, generally wars. There's a lot more to the feudal government style, but that would take up way too much time to dig into for this episode. The feudal government system is easy to just kind of plop in and use because, to be honest, it's the standard. Everyone that's been gaming, even those with little to no gaming experience, have even a vague idea of how this government functions. At least in my experience. Your mileage may vary, of course. Part of the government consideration and thought process is that you also need to think up the common folk's reactions, thoughts, and feelings towards their rulers. If the common folk are content with the way their lives are going, then that's good, awesome. Pretty simple, pretty straightforward. But they could also be angry and upset with how things are going, causing them to speak out and even potentially lead up to a revolt. Just look at France right now in 2023. That's all you need. And the final big consideration I recommend when thinking of government style is the economy. Again, even just a rough and vague system in place is better than not having one at all. Taking time to think up what the most popular trade routes are, who goes where to buy and sell items, who creates what, and who will bring that to where plays a major role in the government and the society of your setting, because then you start answering some questions like, what are the highways in my setting? Where do the roads lead? Who builds the roads? Hey everyone, thanks for tuning into the Game Master. Before we get back to our show, I wanted to take a moment to talk to you about our sponsors. If you are a business owner or an individual who wants to promote your product or service to a passionate and engaged audience, you're in luck. The Game Master is currently open for sponsorship opportunities. Our listeners are fans of all kinds of tabletop role-playing games, and they're always on the lookout for the latest and greatest tools and resources to enhance their gaming experience. By sponsoring the show, you'll have the opportunity to reach this targeted and enthusiastic audience. If you're interested in sponsoring the Game Master, please reach out via email to talon@talonmanly.com. That's TALON@TALONMANLEY.com. We'd love to hear from you and discuss how we could work together to promote your brand. Thanks for your support. Now back to the show. The next part of world building I want to talk about that can influence the culture you're aiming for is the geography. Geography is extremely important in a setting, as it's literally the world your players are exploring. Knowing where your forests, mountains, deserts, swamps, rivers, lakes, and plains are, even just a general idea of their location or name, will help tremendously in building out the culture of your world. Geography heavily influences culture by dictating what the people will eat, what kind of shelters they'll build, what type of clothing they'll wear, what natural resources are around, how they'll behave in certain situations, and thus what the people need to trade with other cultures to obtain the things they're missing. For example, a province set in the shadow of a massive mountain range will experience a lot of runoff water, possibly snow depending on the hemisphere, and possibly not a whole lot of rain because the mountains will block the rain from coming down. So, this province will have built up their towns and villages around the rivers that run off from the mountain. Or maybe the runoff has created a swamp, thus causing the people to dress, behave, and eat differently than the rest of the nation. Which brings me to my next point. While the culture will be throughout your setting, it will have pockets of difference, diversity. Diversity can help spread ideas, ideologies, and traditions throughout the culture of your world. We'll take a look at China as an example of this. China has many different provinces, each with their own cultural differences than the others. While each province will have a lot of similarities in their culture, they'll also have a lot of diversity in their foods, their dress, their traditions, stuff like that. Hey there, everyone. Before digging further into the topic, I want to take a moment to quickly plug some social media and whatnot. You can find me on Twitter, TikTok, and YouTube under the name Talon Manly, as well as the podcast on both YouTube and Spotify. As well, I have a website, talonmanly.com. That's TALONMANLEY.com, where I have exclusive merch, memberships that grant discounts, 48-hour early access to podcast episodes, and a special private Discord section, as well as links to my social media pages and Discord server. If you're interested in supporting me, definitely take a look at the website. Now, I won't keep you any longer. Let's get back to the show. But now that we've beaten that horse beyond dead, let's move on to other parts of building your world. I want to take some time to talk about different techniques for actually constructing this setting. Two specifically, top-down and bottom-up. First, the difference between the two. Top-down world building is where you construct the whole world first and then start building out the smaller details as the players explore the setting. Meanwhile, bottom-up is where you only build out and populate a small area of the world and slowly expand upon it as the players explore. So firstly, let's dive into the top-down method. The top-down method is arguably one of the more popular methods of world building, and it's what I did for a long time and actually just recently did with my current campaign in for D&D 5th edition. I would map out the whole setting, name all the cities and locations, build out the government system, so on and so forth. Then, I would start out with populating the area immediately around the PCs. This method is beneficial if you're going to run something more open-ended. It gives your players a lot of agency about where they go and what they do, allowing for more freedom. The reason it's beneficial is because you can easily populate vast areas the players go into with some template encounters, random NPCs, and random events, as well as plot hooks, all the while knowing what's around the immediate area already, so you don't have to think up whole swaths of land potentially on a whim. Meanwhile, the bottom-up method is what I prefer in my world building nowadays. I build out and populate the starting area for the campaign. I'll then create the plot hooks, important NPCs, tailored encounters, so on and so forth. This type of method is beneficial if you're running a campaign that is more focused on a specific region of the world, as opposed to opening up the whole thing for your players. You can get a lot more detailed with your descriptions and what you build. You can get into more of the nitty-gritty. Hell, sometimes I've even created entire fucking menus for taverns just because I had the extra time on my hands. Another thing to consider when you sit down to actually create a world, and something I really enjoy doing honestly, is collaborate with your players. There's been times where I will draw the map with them watching and take their ideas and implement them, creating entire mountains, cities, historical events, the culture, all of it together. While, yes, it is less control over the end product of the world, it gives the players a ton of emotional attachment and buy-in to the setting outside of their characters. They feel like they actually belong in the world, whereas that same feeling and attachment could be difficult via other methods, but, mind you, not impossible. Regardless of choice, all the methods mentioned here are good and all take some time to learn. But don't also feel like you have to only do things by those methods. There's tons of other ways to create a world. You just need to find what works best for you, how your brain functions, and what's best for your workflow. Hey everyone. Thanks for tuning into the Game Master. Before we get back to our show, I wanted to take a moment to talk to you about our sponsors. If you are a business owner or an individual who wants to promote your product or service to a passionate and engaged audience, you're in luck. The Game Master is currently open for sponsorship opportunities. Our listeners are fans of all kinds of tabletop role-playing games, and they're always on the lookout for the latest and greatest tools and resources to enhance their gaming experience. By sponsoring the show, you'll have the opportunity to reach this targeted and enthusiastic audience. If you're interested in sponsoring the Game Master, please reach out via email to talon@talonmanly.com. That's TALON@TALONMANLEY.com. We'd love to hear from you and discuss how we could work together to promote your brand. Thanks for your support. Now back to the show. One topic I want to touch on is immersion in your world building. If you want to create something truly immersive for your party, there's a few different ways to do that. The best way I can recommend is identify what type of world your players want to play in. Communicate with them about this during your session 0. Do they want a high fantasy setting, a low fantasy setting? Perhaps something along the lines of a steampunk or Victorian themed setting. Giving them some agency over the type of setting they play in will work wonders on the immersion level, because then they have some buy-in, much like I mentioned earlier with one of the world building methods. Another way are pretty simple tips. Stuff like music, atmosphere, maps, handouts, props, shit like that your players can actually physically see, hear, or touch will help improve the amount of immersion in your world. But one thing I have found defeats all of that. Random events. Make the world feel lived in, active, and alive with random events and encounters will go a long way to immerse your players. This can be anything from social encounters to combat encounters, depending on the location the PCs currently are. If they're somewhere dangerous, then maybe some more random combat encounters will be the route as opposed to more social encounters. Personally, every map I make use hexes, which makes it easier for me to track this because every other hex has a 3 in 12 chance for a random encounter, which then goes further with some more tables I've created. And the reason it's a 3 and 12 is because I like my players to roll these dice, and the D12 just isn't really utilized very often in D&D 5th edition, or many other tabletop RPGs, come to think of it. Now, we move on to factions. Much like religion and building out deities, factions are an important part of your setting because these factions tend to have a direct effect on the world that can either act against or for your players, depending on the goals of the faction. A faction can be anything from a nationwide faction like the Trade Consortium, for example, but you can also create smaller factions that may be more localized to just a town or village, like herbalists that gather herbs and plants for the alchemists in the nearby city. How these factions interact with one another is another important consideration, whether they're hostile or rely on one another for success to further their goals. Back to the herbalist example, the alchemists in the city require herbs from the nearby swamp in order to make their salves and potions. So they decide to pay the village's herbalists to gather the herbs for them as they know the area best. Those herbalists will then bring those herbs to the alchemists and maybe sell the extras in the city, making more money to bring home. There's some random encounters for your players right there. On talking about random encounters again. Well, my friends, that brings us to the end of this month's episode. I appreciate your time, and I hope this episode was informative for you and helped shed some light on world building and give you some tips on how to build better worlds. Thank you so much for listening, and as always, happy gaming.